Thank you very much, Sodamani, Gunnar, all of you. So when Thomas asked me to give this keynote, it was a moment of panic for me because I knew it's very, very hard to say no to Thomas. And yet I knew I couldn't do what Maria did and what Vic did, which is summarize a large field in environmental economics and tell you what we've learned after all these years. Because I'm a development economist with interests in environment, I dabble in environment, but I really don't know much environment. You know that, and most importantly, I know that. And so the question was what to do. And what I've decided to do is a little bit in the spirit of what Vic did yesterday. I want to think about methodology. I want to think about what our disciplines have in common, what we need to ask that can be helpful more broadly. So that's what I'm going to do. Very conveniently, I'm going to broaden our notion of the environment to the dictionary notion of our environment, which is just the surroundings or conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives or operates. So that includes, of course, the environment in terms of forests and fields and water, but it also includes markets, institutions, communities, clubs, and anything that mediates our interactions. And I think the point that I want to make today most forcefully, if I succeed in what I want to do, is that there's a lot of emphasis on data. Marlene just talked about data. We talk a lot about impact evaluation. The ADB talk was about impact evaluation, and we're living in a world of big data. And at some level, that's extremely exciting because we can just find out so many things we didn't know. Young researchers often come into that world saying, we did this thing in this little part of Colombia or India or Sri Lanka. Does it replicate? Is it valid? And I think sometimes that might be the wrong question. And what I'd like to do is really think about how outcomes relate to preferences. So what is actually determining outcomes? And it's only when we do that, I'd like to make that case, it's only when we do that can we really find the right levers for policy. And so the idea is that if we want to move from data to policy design, we have to recognize that identical preferences in different environments lead to different outcomes. And so we shouldn't expect that we get the same estimates when we're doing things in different places. If we diagnose these differences, if we really zoom into them, if we put a microscope on them, then that can help us discover policy levers that then can be manipulated to improve welfare. And so we need to move away from replicability, not in the sense that Marlene was talking about. We need to replicate the results with a given data set. But we need to move away from our obsession with, well, is this estimate comparable to what someone found 8,000 miles away in a completely different context? And, but we need to do that carefully with some rigor. And by that I mean we really need to interpret the findings that we're getting. So should we focus on replicability or interpretation? I would argue the latter. Should we focus on impact assessment or mechanism design? Because once we actually understand what's causing these differences, then we can think, okay, now what can we change about the environment? What can we change about the institutions within which people interact to actually get outcomes that we're interested in? So I'm going to do this with a few stories. So there's the lead story, which is gender outcomes and gender bias. This is with two very talented master's students, ex-master's students of mine, Basil Isaac and Akanksha Vardani. At the moment, this is just a theoretical exercise. So I'll talk about that. And then I'll talk about the informational gaps in household adoption of clean fuel. This is with another PhD student who's now a postdoc at Duke with Subrendu and company. This is P.P. Krishnapriya. I'll talk a little bit about political barriers to clean air legislation in India. That's with my colleague Parikshit Ghosh, and this is based on a small survey in Calcutta. And then I'll talk about work with Carla Hoff, which is a lab and field experiment on social contracting, on public goods games, and what you can do to change outcomes in public goods games. And for the most part, I have to apologize that I'll be referring to my own work and work that's not published largely. And the reason for this is very simple. It's a very tiny drop in the ocean, and it's not even the best stuff there by far. But the point is really, I want to convey to you this process by which you look at a data set and then you look and see what you're finding and you puzzle over it, and then you get to a different place where you thought. And I thought that by doing this, I can share the process with you. I can share what I went through, and maybe that's useful, and maybe that's not. We'll give it a try. Okay, so the only exception to that is two very interesting studies. In the last case, one by Louis Putterman and one by James Ferron and co-authors in Liberia. And I think this tells us something important about collective decision making, which I'm interested in. So I'll talk about their work as well. So let's get started. So the question is really, we have a lot of data reflecting gender bias. And so the first question I want to ask is, what exactly does this data represent? One of the most common measures of gender bias is now sex ratios, because every census collects data on men and women. You can compute this all over the world for different age groups, and people have spent a lot of time doing it. So I want to focus on sex ratios. Amartya Sen wrote in the British Medical Journal in 1992, this is just taken out of there, that if we use roughly a ratio of 1 for men to women as the ratio that would persist in the absence of bias, then we can figure out how many women should have been alive but are not alive by comparing the actual ratios with these ratios. And this is what he called the number of missing women, which he estimated to be around 100 million worldwide, most of them in India and China put together. Okay. He goes on, it's just a 2-page article. It got a lot of press and it got a whole field really started. He said this. Ansley Cole, very famous demographer, has done a lot of work on this, where he gets lower estimates, but they're still very big. This is what I want to focus on. He says, what causes the relative neglect and how can it be changed? Traditional cultures and values, education, especially female literacy, women's economic rights, land rights, and other rights, all of these can influence gender bias, and public policy can influence this. So the implicit assumption, which I want to challenge here, is that these ratios actually tell us how much bias there is. There's clearly something wrong, because if we don't have equal numbers, then women are dying at faster rates than men, or they're not being born when they should have been born. But what exactly do these sex ratios tell us? So that's my first example. And I think throughout these stories, what I'm going to do is really say, what can we get out of the data? What can the data help us think about, which gets us to something more important? So do gendered outcomes imply gender bias? Are there pitfalls in an immediate inference of this kind? Okay. So why did we get started on this? Well, if you look below the surface a little bit, so if you look from those numbers of Amartya Sen's, and then you compare adult sex ratios with juvenile sex ratios, you actually find a quite different picture. So you can't see any of this very clearly, but I have adult sex ratios on the left, and the best performer on the left is Russia. Russia is in the middle of the pack when you look at 0 to 4 sex ratios. Okay? India and China are at the bottom in both cases, but they switch places. Okay? If you look at the 5 bottom performers, 5 worst performers, for the aggregate sex ratio, it's Nigeria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, and India. For the juvenile sex ratio, it's South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, China, and India. So it's only China and India who do badly on all counts, but there's a lot of switching of places. Okay, so what's going on here? Clearly, if there was some bias against women, maybe you like young children, you treat differently from older children, but is that really a preference difference? And I'd like to argue not necessarily. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. So India's sex ratios, they're very varied. Amartya Sen points time and again to Kerala, which he says is like the West. It's in the west of India, it's like the West. And then the north, where you have very bad sex ratios. If you look at the aggregate picture, and this is going all the way back to 1871, then you found sex ratios went up, and then they've been steadily declining, And since 91, aggregate sex ratios have been going up again. Juvenile sex ratios have not been going up. They've been going down for the country as a whole. If we look at the states, on the left, so I've picked one state from the north, one from the south, one from the east, and one from the west. Okay. And if you look at this, the states overall, the left side has adult sex ratios, the right side has juvenile sex ratios. So you find that while adult sex ratios have been going up in most states, juvenile sex ratios have been displaying different patterns. Okay? So in Punjab, which is notorious for low sex ratios, that's the one at the bottom. It's actually U-shaped. It went down and then it went up. Okay? If you want to look at Kerala, here you can see the numbers a little bit more clearly. So if you look at Kerala, which is the bottom right corner, it has the highest levels for sure. Okay? But nothing has been going on over time. Not surprisingly, because the sex ratio right now is 0.96, which is typical of the sex ratio at birth. There are more boys born than girls. And so we're right there. And so it's been pretty flat at there. If you look at Uttar Pradesh, you find this pattern for adults. You've been going up for adults, down for kids. Maharashtra, again in the west, up for adults, down for kids. Punjab, up for adults, U-shaped for kids. Okay? Kerala, very flat. So there's a lot to explain in a single country. How can thinking about theory help us do this? So we have a model here, and it's just one slide of equations. That's the only one you have. But I wanted to be able to define gender bias carefully in a way that I felt no one would argue with. So my definition of gender bias, ours, is as follows, that suppose you have a given number of kids, 10 kids, 6 kids, 1 kid, okay? If N1 is greater than N2, so suppose you have N kids, okay? N1 boys and N2 girls, okay? If N1 is bigger than N2, then you prefer more boys and fewer girls than the opposite. So more girls and fewer boys. So if the composition is the same, if you flip identities of boys and girls, you're going to prefer the outcome in which there are more boys to girls. That doesn't say how much you value the second boy relative to the first girl, nothing of the sort. Suppose this is all that you have. And this is just, it's a sort of an axiomatic approach. What do you mean? You have to give content to the word gender bias. This is the content that I give to the term gender bias. And so that's the second equation over there. And then I'm looking at treatment. So people have said that differential treatment to medical care is one big reason for gender bias. So I build this model around treatment. You can build it around anything that you think matters. And so the idea is that you have an initial income, you make fertility decisions, then there's some health shocks. Somebody falls sick, say 1 kid falls sick. You have to decide whether or not to take them to the hospital, and either way, then you have some realized utility. If you take them to the hospital, they get well, and you have that kid survive. If you don't, they don't get well, you have a little more consumption and 1 less kid, and then you have realized utility. So that's broadly the timeline. And I'm just going to show you 3 results with numerical simulations, which are using just a CES utility function. There's nothing special going on here. Okay. So the first result is this, that you'll have unequal treatment cost thresholds. So there will be some treatment cost levels for which you take the boy and the girl, right? Some treatment cost levels for which you take the boy and not the girl. And if you get to really high treatment costs, then again, you're back to taking nobody. So the U-shaped treatment cost is very, very natural if you believe that this is what's going on. You have a lot of gender bias, and nothing is going on with preferences here. You have the same preferences. You have say they're marginally gender biased, or say they're greatly gender biased. It really doesn't matter. If you're far away enough from a health center, you can't do anything about it. And so you'll get sex ratios that are close to sex ratios at birth. Okay, as treatment costs fall and you have to make an active decision, you might take the boy and not the girl. In fact, there will always be a threshold at which you would take the boy, which is higher or lower, whichever way you're thinking about it. So there's a threshold treatment cost at which you would take the boy but not take the girl. And then there's a different threshold for the girl, and then you would take them both if treatment costs fall below that. Okay, so this is just, what this is doing is just simulating that. It's just saying, suppose you have 2 kids, 1 boy and 1 girl. Suppose you have 4 kids, 1 boy and 1 girl. One of them falls sick. Okay, now what I'm doing is taking 2 different levels of gender bias. So if you go to the utility function here, this beta in front of the boys, so it is a parameter capturing gender bias. I'm just varying that beta a little bit. So in one case it's 0.4, in one case it's 0.35. And so you can see that the band changes. And so this is the band of discrimination. But of course you could be outside that band for both, and then both of these communities would have exactly the same sex ratio. So you can't look at the ratio and infer what the bias is going to be. All right? And then if you actually now look at falling treatment costs. So what we've done here is we've just allowed a kid to arrive every period. They fall sick with some independent probability. The family decides whether or not to take them for treatment. Okay? And then you have a sex ratio that's realized. And so the purple dotted line is the treatment cost trajectory. And here you see that the sex ratios are flat, then they go down, and then they go up again. Exactly the mechanism I was talking about right now. Okay. Okay, so that's result 1, that you have non-monotonic sex ratios for any level of gender bias, if you have enough variation in treatment costs over time. Okay. Result number 2 is that sex ratios are uninformative about the difference in bias. Now suppose there are 2 communities that face exactly the same trajectory of treatment costs. You know, there were so many health centers in every state in India in 1951, then there were so many more in 1961, and suppose all villages face the identical trajectory of treatment costs. Okay? It would still happen that the difference in bias, so there's a given bias difference, the difference in sex ratios is going to vary, even for the same trajectory, because there are cumulative effects here. So at some point treatment costs were high, you took both of them, then treatment costs fell, you took one and not the other, so then now you have a different sex ratio, now treatment costs fall further, and so you can't look at the gap between the green line where there's less bias and the yellow line where there's more bias and say, well, we can look at different states and rank their gender bias based on the difference in the sex ratio, because it's the combination of the environment broadly defined, okay, and the preference. And if we don't realize that, then we'll be making the wrong inference. Okay. Result 3, again, everything is just coming out of the same mechanism. Result 3 says that, well, it's not only uninformative, these sex ratios need not only be uninformative about the difference in bias, they could be uninformative on the ranks of bias. So you could have a community with more gender bias and a lower sex ratio, or it could have more gender bias and a higher sex ratio than the other community. And you can't really tell because in general, treatment trajectories are different. So if now we move away from the same treatment trajectory, then you can flip ranks. Okay? So these are some of the pitfalls of inference with gendered outcomes when you're trying to look at gender bias. And so you might look at the Indian case and say, look, things are really getting better. This is what the Indian politicians are saying all the time. Okay? And maybe they are getting better. And maybe it's just a transitional phase when you have these health centers and you expand enough, but we don't know. You need to look at that more carefully. So that's story number 1. Okay? And I'm going to now go briefly through the other stories. Okay, so this is the household fuel choice experiment. So Krishnapriya took in her thesis research 2 very different states. One was Kerala in the south, which is where she's from, and the other was Uttar Pradesh in the north. Okay, very different sex ratios, very different observed bias if you just go and hang around there. All right. Kerala is highly literate, it's matrilineal. It's exceptional in that respect in India. Uttar Pradesh, exclusionary in many ways. You often can't see women when you go because, you know, they have their sari sort of here. All right? All right. So she had treatment arms. So what she did in each of these areas is she picked a bunch of villages and she said, look, if we really care about, it's women who really suffer this, the effects of being in a house with a lot of air pollution. So in some villages, let's give information to the woman. And in some villages, let's give it to the man about the bad effects of fuel on health. And then, of course, there's some control villages. And the outcomes that she measured were how many people switched. And the interventions she looked at were 3. She looked at solar lamps, replacing kerosene lamps. So that's the first panel there. Then she looked at these chimneys. You can't see them very well, but you see that little pipe in the second panel. So that's where the smoke should go out from. And in the left side, the smoke is coming into her face. And then pressure cookers, because the food cooks faster, there's less smoke. Okay, here's what she found. She found the 2 states remarkably similar in outcomes. So she found that there was a huge uptake of the battery-operated lights. Okay, she found that in Kerala there was a little bit more. If you look at the men versus women, it made a little bit of difference on the uptake of the smokeless stoves, but not very much. It was generally low. And then if you look at the pressure cookers, well, you actually found that in UP, a lot of women had them already, and you find very little impact. Okay, so then the question is what's going on here? And again, Krishna Priya's thesis, the 2nd chapter is a model, and the 3rd chapter is this experiment. And what the model does is it really uses the cheap talk literature. So it says that, look, suppose you give the information to the woman, okay, but the man is the decision maker. Then the woman is going and telling the man, look, you know, here is this thing that is really good, I think we should do it. Okay, so will the man listen? And the standard result in the cheap talk literature is that I listen if it really has information. That would help me. So if it's something that I really want to do and I believe that you would say this to me, when it's really good for me and not when it's not good for me. That's the main cheap talk result in the literature. Then I'm going to move. And so if you think about the bargaining that's going on here, maybe the things that are actually going to change are the ones that have buy-in from both parties. And maybe the lights are like that. I don't know if that's the case, but that's one plausible hypothesis. It's something that can help us make sense of the data. Okay, so that's story number 2. Story number 3. Unfortunately, 13 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are in India. And Delhi is the worst. So that's that data. All the reds are India. So what a lot of cities have done is to go in for fuel changes, mandatory fuel changes in public transport. Okay. Now the puzzle was that this happened in Delhi in 2001. So the Supreme Court in 1998 says you have to switch over to public transport that's clean. Okay. The change actually occurred in 2001. Many other cities just carried on business as normal. Okay. In Calcutta, the switch happened in 2008. It was mandated in 2008, finally. The courts resisted a lot, the High Court resisted a lot. It finally pushed for the change. It came about in 2008. Nobody did anything. There were huge protests. Buses caught fire. It was really a big issue. And so there was this puzzle that we had, Parikshit and I had. Why are these 2 cities so different? Are they really different? Are preferences different, or is it something else? And so we did this survey, a very small survey, of these auto drivers. So these were the ones, this is the smoke coming out before, and they had to switch to this. Okay. We did the survey, and we did it at gas stations initially. And we asked them, do you support this or not? And one thing that was really puzzling for us is that the ones that rented their vehicles disliked the change more than the ones that owned it. Now, this was exactly the opposite of what we thought should be true. Their capital costs, we understand, it's a poor country, you know. But why are the renters protesting? And when we asked them about health benefits, the renters said, no, they're health benefits, you know, we feel the difference. So what's going on? And so, so what we did was, we had these surveys that asked them details about exactly how many kilometers they've gone, you know, what their fuel costs were. If we asked them the cost of fuel, it was exactly the same, obviously, it's mandated. All right? When we asked them how many kilometers they drove, what they spent on fuel, then we got a very different picture. But before explaining this, let me just go back to that photograph that I put there for a reason. So if you look at these autos, the autos in Calcutta are very different from the ones in Delhi. So the ones in Delhi are like little taxis. And, you know, in most parts of the developing world, you'll find those. The ones in Calcutta are more like tiny little buses. I know this sounds strange, but they have a route on them. And that's what I wanted you to see. It says Route 42. What this meant was that their earnings were very steady. You take this auto, you wait for it to fill up, and then you go across to the end of the route. Okay? Everyone pays you a fixed amount. Okay? It also made it very easy for us to figure out how much they were driving. They didn't need to figure it out. We could just see how many trips they made, and we could figure it out. All right. So when we did this, we found that we computed the unit fuel price, which should have been the same. It turned out to be very different. So in the previous period, we asked them before the change and after the change. So after the change, they were all paying for gas. It was all the same. Before the change, it turned out it was really quite different. It was 37 rupees a litre for the rented autos and 46 for the petrol autos. And the reason was because the rented autos were not using petrol at all. They were using some gunky mix of things because they didn't really care about the capital. And so they were in a very different position. They were poorer and they were in a very different position. And so there were two lessons from here. One is that the institutions really matter. The institutions in the public transport sector really matter. And the second is a much broader point, which is when you estimate impact, and here you're looking at validity, replicability, when you're estimating impact, then you might not be estimating the impact that you think you're estimating. You might think that the air has got much cleaner because we moved from petrol to gas, but you really moved from something else, and you don't even know what it is without digging really deep to gas. Okay? Okay, so let me get to my last story, which is the social contracting story. So I'm sure that everyone here has played a public goods game. Okay, I'm not even going to tell you what they are, because you've probably played not one but many, with the exception of Madhavan, but he can find out later maybe. Okay, so people have played public games all over the world. You know, they've played them in labs, and they've played them in lab and field, and they've played them in field. And they've played them with different incentives, and then they've tweaked them around a little bit. And sort of the public goods literature reminds you of this Dr. Seuss book, which I can't remember the name of. Not in the car, it's just, you do it in all green eggs and ham. Yeah, and so you're thinking about all these places, and these public goods games have been played everywhere, right? And then the question is, what should you take away from this? And I think people broadly take away, and I think that's correct, which is that you don't defect, you don't play the Nash equilibrium, you don't cooperate, you do something in the middle, and as you play more and more, you tend to become more and more selfish, broadly. That's what we want. Okay, so what Carla and I did in Uttar Pradesh was we did a different game, which we called the social contracting game, and this is very similar to what Louis Putterman and co-authors did in a lab in Brown. So we had them play a public goods game. One interesting insight from the field is we actually tried to get them to play a public goods game, but didn't succeed. So Carla, really, hats off to her. She's very, very meticulous, which can make her very exhausting sometimes, but she's very meticulous. So she would, you know, do this training, and then she would say, okay, now let's play it. Now what did you do? You know, and why did you do this? So how much are you going to do? And if you did this, how much are you going to get? And she did this again and again, and we just found that people were not getting the public goods game. They didn't pass her test. Okay, so she changed the game, and she did a public gift game. She said, let's forget about all this. You're not going to get a multiple of anything that you put in. You're just going to give a gift, and you're going to decide on your gift and 2 other people. You're going to have groups of 3. You're going to get, say, 10 rupees, and you're going to decide how much to give as a gift. You're not going to get anything out of that. The other 2 people are going to get that gift. So we still double it. It still has the same flavor, but these 2 guys are now going to get it. Okay? And so that's the public gift game. It worked wonderfully because everybody understood gifts and reciprocity. They found it really hard to understand this fractional stuff of how much we're going to get back. So we did the public gift game. Then, after doing that, so we did the public gift game for 6 rounds. Then we said, well, and this happens in many adaptations of the public good game. We said, okay, now you can introduce fines and monitoring, and you can vote on the level of the fine. So you can keep it at 0, so you can just carry on playing the public gift game, or each period you can vote to increase the fine by 1. You can increase the minimum contribution by 1, and then if you can monitor people. If they don't pay, then you don't get anything, and so on. Standard sort of thing. So then we had this social contracting game. This was a social contract because you had now the level of contribution that the majority chose. Okay, this was every alternate period. So we did this for 6 rounds, and then that for 15 rounds. All right, and this is what we found. So when you did the public goods game, the public gift game, when we did the public gift game, we found that different groups of people had very different gifts. So you could average gifts. So different, when you looked at this, and so if you look at the first 6 rounds, you have these different levels. Okay, now you could stop there and you could say, look, there are different levels of cooperation, and this is what explains why some communities do well and other communities do badly. Now when you played the social contracting game, you have this external enforcement coming in and someone helping you run the whole system. Now you find that the first 3 quartiles, so 75% of the people who contributed, if you look from the top in the public gift game, the 75% biggest contributors now all start to look the same. So you bring in a set of rules, and you really eliminate this difference between the first 3 groups. The people who contributed the least still tend to contribute less. They benefit from the social contract, but not as much. Okay, so that's the broad finding. I want to now just say, how does this relate to Putterman and to James Ferron? So Putterman's work found, and there are other co-authors there, I'm sorry, there's Dalbo, Putterman, and there's a third person whose name I've forgotten. This is in the AER in 2010. And they found that what they did was an experiment at Brown where people chose by voting again, and then some of those people actually got to keep their vote. They played their vote. Other people got assigned by a computer a certain level of contribution. Okay? And then they found that when people actually chose what they were going to do, they contributed much more. They were much more likely to cooperate. So for the same level of fine, the same community, if you actually chose that level of fine, rather than having it imposed on you, you cooperated much more. You were much more likely to, I'm mixing up fine and contribution. If you chose that level of mandatory contribution, then you were much more likely to actually contribute than if it was the same level was imposed on you. So that tells us something about deliberative democracy. The last thing is James Fearon and co-authors, and this is in Liberia, in post-conflict Liberia. And there what happened was that the UK aid agency, DFID, gave some money for communities to help build themselves. Okay? And so what they did was go and play public goods games in these communities. And in some communities, this relates interestingly to the We Need initiatives that we're starting at EFD and some of the questions we're asking. So in some of these groups, they were all women. And in some of these groups, they were mixed, men and women. The results were really fascinating because they found that when you looked at the all-women groups in the control, they did much better than the mixed groups. People contributed more. There's nothing there, so it's fine. You can. They contributed more. When you actually brought in this intervention where people had to sit together, they had to decide on a project, what are we going to do? We have to pick a leader, we have to decide how to spend this money that's coming, we have to maintain, books of account and so on. Then they found that the gap, the women's groups stayed where they are. The mixed groups now not only caught up, but they chose better leaders, they had more processes in place, and what they find is that there was a lot more talk that was going on. So what happened with the women's group is they just said, yeah, whatever, we trust you, go ahead and do what you're doing. With the mixed groups, there was informational exchange, there was negotiation, there was deliberation. And that really helped going forward. And so it wasn't as if they did much better, but the leaders stayed in place longer and they find some outcomes were better. So I think all I want to say is especially to the graduate students here or the ones who have not yet done PhDs, don't set your goal as finding results that someone else has found somewhere else. Let's celebrate the difference and say, look, why is it different? And maybe that will give us a clue to how to change policy. Stop.